The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when a 12-year-old boy made his way through the bustling airport terminal. His confident stride reflected the familiarity of someone who had grown up around airports, thanks to his father's position as a senior airline pilot. The boy's bright eyes sparkled with excitement. He was finally old enough to use his dad's employee benefits to fly alone to visit his grandparents. He had done everything right that morning. His backpack was neatly packed with his favorite books, his gaming console, and the special lunch his mom had prepared. The documentation proving his right to fly was carefully tucked into the front pocket of his jacket, just as his father had shown him. His dad had made sure to call ahead to the airport staff, confirming all arrangements for his son's first solo flight. The early morning check-in had gone smoothly. The ground staff had been professional and kind, double-checking his documents and giving him his first-class boarding pass with a warm smile. The boy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He was handling this all on his own, just like a grown-up. As one of the first passengers to board, he walked down the jet bridge, his heart thumping with excitement. The fresh smell of coffee wafted from the galley as he stepped onto the aircraft. He glanced at his boarding pass and began making his way to his assigned seat in first class, remembering his father's advice to always be polite and follow the proper procedures. That's when everything changed. A flight attendant, who had been arranging magazines in the galley, spotted him and immediately frowned. Her whole demeanor shifted as she watched the young boy in his casual clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a comfortable hoodie, walking confidently toward the first-class cabin. "Excuse me." Her sharp voice cut through the quiet morning air. "Where do you think you're going?" The boy turned, slightly startled by her tone but remaining composed. He reached for his documents, just as he'd practiced. "I have my boarding pass right here, ma'am. I'm in seat 2A. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She didn't even glance at the papers he was trying to show her. Instead, she moved to block his path, her body language becoming increasingly hostile. "How did you get past security? This section is for first-class passengers only." "I know," the boy replied calmly, though his heart was starting to race. "I'm traveling on my father's employee benefits. All my documentation is right here." But she wasn't listening. Her hand was already reaching for her crew phone, her eyes never leaving him as if he might make a run for it. "We have a situation in first class," she spoke into the device, her voice tight with suspicion. "I need security here immediately." Other passengers were beginning to board now, some slowing down to watch the scene unfold. The boy could feel their stares on his back, could hear their whispered conversations. His hands started to tremble slightly, but he remembered his father's words. "Always stay calm, always be polite, and always know your rights." He took a deep breath and tried one more time. "Please, if you could just look at my documents." "Stand right where you are," the flight attendant interrupted, her voice getting louder. "Security is on their way." The boy's throat felt tight, but he stood his ground. He could hear heavy footsteps approaching from behind. In just a few minutes, this normal morning would turn into something that would change not only his life, but the entire airline industry's approach to prejudice and profiling. What no one on that plane knew yet was that in the cockpit, just a few meters away, a highly respected pilot was going through his pre-flight checks, completely unaware that his son was about to face one of the most humiliating experiences of his young life. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would spark a national conversation about bias, assumptions, and the need for change in the airline industry. Other crew members were now gathering around, their faces showing a mix of concern and suspicion. None of them bothered to check the documents the boy was still holding out. None of them asked him any questions about his father or his right to be there. They had made their assumptions, and those assumptions were about to lead them into a situation they would never forget. Two security officers rushed onto the plane, their heavy footsteps echoing through the cabin. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows as they approached, their faces set with stern expressions. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood perfectly still, his documentation still held out in front of him like a shield. "This is the situation," the taller officer asked the flight attendant, barely glancing at the young boy. His hand was already reaching for his radio, his stance rigid and intimidating. "Yes," the flight attendant replied, her voice sharp with authority. He's trying to access the first-class cabin without proper authorization. The boy tried once again, his voice smaller now but still steady. I have my papers right here. My dad works for the airline. Put your hands where we can see them, the second officer interrupted, taking a step closer. His hand moved to grab the boy's arm, firm enough to make the child wince. By now, more passengers were boarding, creating a backup in the jet bridge. Many had their phones out, recording the scene unfolding before them. Some whispered among themselves, while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. A businesswoman in a sharp suit stood filming everything, her face twisted with concern and disapproval. You're hurting me, the boy said quietly, looking at the officer's hand on his arm. The grip didn't loosen. Instead, the officer began trying to guide him toward the exit. We'll sort this out off the aircraft, the first officer announced, reaching for the boy's backpack. That's when an elderly passenger stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. Have you even looked at his documents? He's been trying to show them to you. The security officers exchanged glances but didn't release their hold. The flight attendant crossed her arms, her face flushed. We have procedures to follow. We can't just let anyone walk into first class claiming they have documentation. But you haven't even checked. Another passenger called out from the growing crowd. The boy felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. His father had always taught him to stay strong in difficult situations, to know his worth, to remain dignified. But standing there, being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers, dignity felt like a heavy weight to bear. A young woman in business attire stepped forward, her phone steadily recording. This is completely unacceptable, she stated firmly. We're all watching you manhandle a child who's been nothing but cooperative. He's been trying to show you his documents this entire time. The tension in the cabin was becoming unbearable. More passengers were voicing their concerns, creating a chorus of disapproval. The flight attendant's confident demeanor began to crack slightly as she realized how many people were recording the incident. We're just following protocol, she insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. The security officers, however, remained unmoved. They began to pull the boy toward the exit, ignoring his continued attempts to explain. His perfectly packed backpack slipped from his shoulder, spilling his carefully prepared lunch onto the floor. The gaming console his parents had given him for his birthday clattered across the aisle. Please, the boy tried one last time, his voice barely a whisper now. Just call my dad. He's actually. But before he could finish his sentence, a new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive click of the cockpit door opening. Heavy footsteps approached from the front of the aircraft, and a commanding voice rang out. What exactly is going on with my son? The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The security officer's grip loosened slightly as they turned toward the voice. The flight attendant's face drained of color as she slowly pivoted to face the approaching figure. The passengers who had been recording fell silent, their phones still raised, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. There, standing in his crisp pilot's uniform, 4 stripes gleaming on his shoulders, was the boy's father. His face was a mixture of controlled anger and professional composure, the look of someone who had spent years mastering his emotions while in uniform. The morning sun streaming through the windows glinted off his captain's wings, and in that moment, everyone in the cabin realized just how terribly wrong their assumptions had been. The captain's footsteps echoed through the suddenly silent cabin as he approached the group. 15 years of commanding aircraft had taught him how to control a situation with just his presence, and right now, that presence filled the entire space. His shoulders were straight, his jaw set, but his eyes held a storm of emotions as they moved from his son to the security officers still gripping the boy's arm. Release my son. Now. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. The security officer's hands dropped away as if they'd been burned. The boy immediately moved to his father's side, fighting to maintain his composure even as his shoulders trembled slightly. The flight attendant's face had turned an ashen shade of gray. Captain, we didn't know. We thought. You thought. The captain interrupted, his tone measured but intense. No, I don't believe you thought at all. My son had proper documentation. He followed every procedure. I personally called ahead to notify the crew about his travel arrangements. He paused, letting his words sink in. What you did was make assumptions, dangerous, harmful assumptions. The captain placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the slight tremors running through the boy's body. Around them, passengers continued recording, their phones capturing every word of this powerful moment. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to highlight the captain's stripes, a stark reminder of the authority these crew members had chosen to ignore. "Sir," the taller security officer started, "we were just responding to a crew member's call about an unauthorized." "Unauthorized?" The captain's eyebrow rose. "My son was holding his documentation the entire time. Did any of you," his gaze swept across the group, "take even a moment to look at his papers? To listen to his explanation? To treat him with basic human dignity?" A murmur of approval rippled through the watching passengers. The businesswoman who had been recording stepped forward. "Captain, I have the entire incident recorded, including their refusal to check his documentation multiple times." The captain nodded gratefully. "Thank you." He turned back to the crew members. "This is exactly the kind of incident that damages not just individual lives, but the entire airline industry. My son, a 12-year-old child, was physically handled and humiliated because you couldn't imagine that he belonged in first class, because you couldn't imagine that he might be the son of a pilot." The flight attendant's eyes were now fixed on the floor, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The security officers shifted uncomfortably, their badges and uniforms suddenly seeming to weigh heavily on them. "Dad," the boy said softly, touching his father's arm. It was the first time he'd spoken since his father's arrival. "My stuff." He gestured to his scattered belongings on the floor, the spilled lunch, the gaming console, the papers that had fallen from his grasp when the officers grabbed him. The captain's face softened as he looked at his son, then hardened again as he surveyed the scene. "Clean it up," he commanded the security officers. "All of it, and handle everything with care." As the officers scrambled to collect the boy's belongings, the captain pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the chief pilot and the head of security. This incident will be fully investigated." He looked at each crew member in turn. "I suggest you all prepare to explain why you chose to physically confront a minor without even checking his documentation." An older passenger, who had been watching everything unfold, spoke up. "Captain, will you still be flying this aircraft?" After all this, the captain looked down at his son, who was watching him with trust despite everything that had just happened. "Yes, I will," he replied firmly. "Because that's my job, and I do it with professionalism and integrity. I expect the same from every member of this airline's staff." He squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "And my son will be sitting in his assigned first-class seat, exactly where he belongs." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Several passengers stepped forward to offer words of support to both father and son. The crew members, meanwhile, stood in shamefaced silence, watching as their actions and assumptions unraveled into what would soon become a viral incident and a powerful catalyst for change in airline policy. The captain knelt down to his son's eye level, his voice softening. "Are you okay? Do you still want to make this flight?" The boy straightened his shoulders, showing a strength that moved many of the watching passengers. "Yes, Dad, I can do it." He managed a small smile. "Just like you taught me. Stay strong, know your worth." The captain's eyes glistened with pride and pain, pride in his son's resilience, pain that he had to show such resilience in the first place. As he stood back up, his expression made it clear to everyone watching that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. This would be a moment of reckoning, not just for these crew members, but for the entire airline industry's approach to bias and prejudice. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance of consequences and accountability. The captain's phone call to airline management had set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. Senior airline officials arrived at the gate, their faces grave as they took in the situation. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating a scene that would soon make headlines across the country. "We need statements from everyone involved," announced the airline's chief of station operations, who had rushed to the gate after receiving the captain's call. Her eyes moved from the security officers to the flight attendant, then to the passengers who were still recording. "And we'll need copies of those videos if you're willing to share them." The flight attendant and security officers were quickly removed from the aircraft, their faces ashen as they were led away by airline management. The passengers watched in silence, many of them still processing what they had witnessed. The businesswoman who had been recording approached the airline officials, already pulling up the video on her phone. "I caught everything from the moment they grabbed him," she said firmly, "and I'm happy to provide a statement." Several other passengers stepped forward, offering their own recordings and accounts. The elderly woman who had first spoken up in the boy's defense dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I've been flying for 40 years, she told the airline officials. "I've never seen anything like this. That poor child." Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the boy sat in his rightful seat, his father kneeling beside him in the aisle. The captain's uniform gleamed under the cabin lights as he carefully checked his son's arm where the security officer had grabbed him. "Does it still hurt?" the captain asked softly, his professional demeanor giving way to fatherly concern. The boy shook his head, though his eyes told a different story. "I'm okay, Dad, really." He managed a small smile. "But I think I understand now what you always talk about at dinner, about why your training programs are so important." The captain's throat tightened at his son's words. For years, he had been advocating for better training and awareness in the airline industry. Now his own son had become a living example of why such changes were necessary. A new flight attendant approached them, her manner gentle and professional. "Captain, the replacement crew is here. We're ready to proceed with boarding whenever you give the word." She turned to the boy, her smile warm and genuine. "And can I get you anything? A soda? Some snacks?" The boy politely asked for a glass of apple juice, his natural politeness showing through despite everything that had happened. Several passengers watching the interaction shook their heads in amazement at his composure. The captain stood, straightening his uniform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the cabin, his voice carrying the authority of his position, "I apologize for the delay in our departure. I want to assure you that what happened here today will be thoroughly investigated. As your captain, I promise you a safe and professional flight to our destination." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the passengers. An executive in a business suit called out, "We trust you, Captain. It's good to see someone taking a stand." As the remaining passengers boarded, many stopped to offer words of support or gentle pats on the boy's shoulder. A young mother with 2 children paused in the aisle. "You were so brave," she told him, her eyes glistening. "My kids, they need to see people standing up like this." The airline officials continued their preliminary investigation at the gate. Statements were taken, videos were collected, and reports were filed. The incident was already spreading across social media, with the first clips beginning to go viral. In the cockpit, as the captain prepared for takeoff, his first officer expressed quiet solidarity. "You're doing the right thing, making this public," he said as they went through their pre-flight checks. "This industry needs to change." The captain nodded, his hands moving professionally over the controls even as his mind stayed partly with his son in the cabin behind him. "It's not just about my boy anymore," he replied. "It's about every child who looks like him, every parent who worries like I do." He paused, checking an instrument. "This ends now. Today." Back in the first-class cabin, the boy sipped his apple juice, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Stay strong, know your worth." He looked out the window at the morning sun, understanding that his experience would help prevent other kids from going through the same thing. Sometimes, he realized, being strong meant letting your story be heard, even when it hurt to tell it. By the time the plane landed at its destination 3 hours later, the incident had exploded across social media. Videos taken by passengers had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments. The airline's phones were ringing non-stop, and news vans had already gathered outside their headquarters. The boy's grandparents were waiting at the arrival gate, having been called ahead by their son to explain what had happened. His grandmother's eyes were red from crying, but she held herself tall and dignified. When she finally wrapped her arms around her grandson, she whispered, "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. So very proud." The captain emerged from the cockpit after completing his post-flight duties, his uniform still crisp despite the emotional morning. As he approached his family, several passengers stopped to shake his hand or pat him on the back. A young father with tears in his eyes said quietly, "Thank you for showing our children what it means to stand up for what's right." In the terminal, airline executives had arranged an immediate meeting room. The company's senior vice president of operations had flown in specifically to handle the situation. Her face was serious as she addressed the captain and his family. "First, I want to apologize personally," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened today goes against everything our airline claims to stand for. But apologies aren't enough. We need real change." The boy sat between his father and grandmother, listening as the executives talked about immediate actions. The flight attendant and security officers had been placed on immediate leave. A full investigation was being launched. Sensitivity training programs would be reviewed and overhauled. But it was what happened next that really caught everyone's attention. The boy raised his hand quietly, just as he would in school. The room fell silent. "Can I say something?" he asked politely. The senior vice president leaned forward. "Of course, we're all listening." "I don't want those people to lose their jobs," the boy said, his voice clear and thoughtful. "I want them to learn and do better. Maybe they could help teach others what they learn." The adults in the room exchanged glances, many blinking back tears. He was a child showing more wisdom and compassion than many grown-ups could manage. His father squeezed his shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need," he said, looking at the executives. "This isn't about punishment. It's about education and change." Outside the meeting room, the story was taking on a life of its own. News channels were picking up the footage. Social media was flooded with reactions. But what caught most people's attention wasn't just the incident itself, it was the response to it. The airline's social media team shared a statement that afternoon, quoting the boy's words about learning and doing better. The post went viral within hours, touching hearts and sparking discussions across the country. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering support and resources. Other airlines began reviewing their own training procedures. Parents shared stories of similar experiences their children had faced, finally feeling brave enough to speak up. In the airport hotel that evening, the boy sat with his grandparents, watching the news coverage on TV. His grandfather, a former civil rights activist, held his hand tightly. "You know," his grandfather said softly, "sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. What happened to you was wrong, but how you handled it, that's going to help so many other people." The boy looked up at the TV, where they were showing a clip of him trying to show his documentation to the flight attendant. But instead of feeling sad or angry, he felt something different now, hope. His phone buzzed with messages from his school friends who had seen the videos. His best friend had written, "You're trending, but more importantly, you're making a difference." Later that night, as the boy got ready for bed, he overheard his father on the phone with the airline's training department. They were discussing plans for a new program, one that would use today's incident as a teaching moment for all airline staff. "No other child should ever have to go through this," his father was saying. "But since it happened, let's make sure it creates lasting change." The boy climbed into bed, thinking about everything that had happened. He remembered how scared he'd been when the security officers grabbed him, but also how strong he'd felt when his father stood up for him. Most importantly, he remembered the supportive words and actions of the passengers who had spoken up. As he drifted off to sleep, he realized something important. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. His father had always told him that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Today, he understood exactly what that meant. 1 week after the incident, the airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity. In a large conference room overlooking the city, the captain sat beside his son, facing a panel of airline executives and civil rights leaders. The morning light filtered through the windows, highlighting the determination on every face in the room. "We've reviewed all the footage and witness statements," the airline's CEO began, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "What happened was completely unacceptable. But your son's suggestion about turning this into a learning opportunity, that's exactly what we need to do." The boy sat up straighter in his chair, still somewhat amazed that his words had made such an impact. He wore a neat button-up shirt today, but his father had told him he could dress however he wanted, that no one should ever be judged by their clothes. The flight attendant who had started the incident was present too, sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Over the past week, she had gone through an intensive awareness training program. Her face showed genuine remorse as she asked permission to speak. "I spent every day thinking about what I did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never thought of myself as someone who would profile anyone, especially a child. But that's exactly what I did. I made assumptions without even looking at the documents. She paused, gathering herself. "I want to be part of making sure this never happens to anyone else." The security officers had made similar commitments. Instead of losing their jobs, they were now working with the airline's training department, using their experience to help others understand the impact of unconscious bias. A civil rights leader leaned forward, her eyes kind but determined. "What we're proposing is a complete overhaul of airline training procedures. We want to use this incident, with your permission, as a case study. Real change happens when people see real examples." The boy's father nodded. "My son and I have discussed this. We're willing to share our story if it helps create meaningful change." The airline was taking unprecedented steps. They announced a new training program called Check Your Assumptions, which would be mandatory for all staff. The boy's suggestion had sparked something bigger than anyone expected. Later that afternoon, the boy visited the airline's training center with his father. New posters lined the walls, showing diverse groups of passengers with the simple message, "Everyone deserves to fly with dignity." In one of the training rooms, a group of flight attendants was watching the video from the incident, followed by discussions about what they could have done differently. One of the trainee flight attendants raised her hand during the session. "I have a question for the captain's son," she said gently. "What would you want us to remember most from your experience?" The boy thought for a moment before answering. "Just look at people as people first. Check the documents before making decisions. And remember that everyone has a story you don't know about." His simple words brought tears to many eyes in the room. The training instructor wrote them on the board, where they would remain as a daily reminder. The media attention continued to grow, but the airline was handling it differently now. Instead of trying to minimize the incident, they were openly discussing their efforts to change. Other airlines began reaching out, wanting to implement similar training programs. The boy's school invited his father to speak at an assembly about standing up for what's right. Students listened intently as the captain explained how one moment of injustice could lead to positive change if people were willing to learn from it. At home that evening, the boy found a letter in the mail. It was from a 10-year-old girl in another state who had seen his story. She wrote about how she had always been afraid to fly because of how she might be treated. "But now," she wrote, "knowing that airlines are changing because of what happened to you, I feel braver." His father found him crying over the letter in his room. "You okay, buddy?" he asked softly. The boy wiped his eyes and smiled. "Yeah, Dad. I just never thought that something bad that happened to me could help other kids feel better." That night, as they sat together watching more news coverage of the airline's changes, the boy realized something important. Sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the best changes, not just for one person, but for everyone. His father had always taught him to stand up for what's right, but now he understood that standing up wasn't just about being brave in the moment. It was about being brave enough to share your story so others could learn from it. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning on the airplane. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the airline's training center as the boy and his father walked through the front doors. They were there for a special ceremony, the graduation of the first class of flight crew members to complete the new comprehensive training program. The large auditorium was packed with airline staff, industry leaders, and media representatives. On the stage, a banner read, "Creating Change Through Understanding." The boy couldn't help but smile when he saw one corner of the banner decorated with a small airplane drawn by elementary school students who had written to him over the past months. The flight attendant who had confronted him that day was now standing at the podium, looking very different from the person who had made those harsh assumptions 6 months ago. Her voice was clear and confident as she addressed the room. "When I started my career in aviation, I thought I knew everything about customer service," she began. "But it took a 12-year-old boy to teach me the most important lesson of all, that true service means seeing people for who they are, not who we assume them to be." In the audience, several of the graduating crew members wiped away tears. They had spent the past months not just learning new procedures, but really understanding the impact of their actions on passengers' lives. The boy's father, still in his captain's uniform after an early morning flight, squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "You doing okay?" he whispered. The boy nodded, thinking about how much had changed. The airline's new training program had been adopted by 6 other major carriers. The security officers who had grabbed him that day were now leading workshops on de-escalation and respectful passenger interaction. More importantly, letters kept coming in from families sharing how the changes had made them feel safer and more respected when flying. One of the security officers stepped up to speak next. His voice was humble as he shared his story. "I used to think security meant being tough and suspicious. Now I understand that true security comes from treating everyone with dignity and respect while following proper procedures. It's not about making quick judgments, it's about making right ones." The boy remembered how scared he had felt when that same officer had grabbed his arm. But today, watching him teach others about respect and understanding, he felt something different: hope and pride. A young flight attendant trainee raised her hand during the question session. "What's the most important change you've seen in these 6 months?" she asked. The boy's father stood up to answer. "It's not just about new rules or procedures," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "It's about changing hearts. Every week, I hear stories from crew members who stopped themselves from making assumptions, who took the extra moment to check documents, who remembered my son's story and chose to act differently." After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and experiences. The boy overheard snippets of conversation about how the training had changed their perspective, how they now saw their jobs differently. A group of young passengers approached him, kids who had been inspired by his story to join the airline's new youth aviation program. One of them, a small girl with bright eyes, told him, "Because of you, I'm not scared to fly anymore. My mom says you helped make the sky belong to everyone." Later that evening, the boy sat in the cockpit of his father's parked plane, looking out at the sunset, painting the sky in beautiful colors. His father was doing some paperwork in the captain's seat beside him. "Dad," he said thoughtfully, "remember when you used to tell me that one person can make a difference?" His father looked up, smiling. "I do. I never really believed it before, but now," he paused, watching a plane take off in the distance, "now I see that sometimes all it takes is one moment of standing up for what's right, and then other people will stand up too." The flight attendant who had once confronted him walked past the cockpit, stopping to wave. She was wearing a new pin on her uniform, a small symbol of the change she had helped create. The boy waved back, remembering his own words from months ago about wanting people to learn and do better rather than just being punished. As they drove home that evening, they passed a billboard near the airport. It showed a diverse group of passengers and crew members with the words, "Everyone's Sky," written in bold letters. The boy smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, another kid was looking up at an airplane and feeling not fear or worry, but excitement and belonging. His father had always told him that change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one person, one moment, one decision at a time. Looking back at the past 6 months, the boy realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage, and that standing up for what's right isn't just about that one moment, it's about all the moments that come after when other people choose to stand up too.